All right. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for coming to the lecture today. It's my pleasure to welcome you here and then to introduce Emily Nachison. Her work combines glass, fiber, mixed media into sculptures and installations that evoke mythology, scientific history, and New Age idealism, one of my favorite three-word phrases on earth. She has had solo and group exhibitions throughout the United States and is currently working on a project in Scotland that I hope she'll talk about. She has received grants and awards from the Regional Arts Council in Portland and Worksound Gallery and Pilchuck Glass School. Emily earned her MFA from Cranbrook Academy of Art in 2010 and her BFA from the Maryland Institute College of Art in 2006. She's currently the interim fiber department chair at the Oregon College of Art and Craft. And she is terribly worried right now that I'm going to tell an embarrassing story about her from her undergraduate days, or graduate days, sorry. But I'm not, I'm just gonna say, please welcome Emily Nachison.
Can you hear me okay if I stand here? You can't tell any embarrassing stories about me because there are none. So first of all, I wanted to thank everyone for coming out today, and I also wanted to just say how happy I am to be back and to be visiting all of you. I've been very honored to come back as a visiting fiber artist to speak, and I wanted to thank Mark Newport and the incredible fiber department that I met this weekend for your hospitality and for a truly excellent weekend. It's been really great meeting all of you. So, I thought I would start off this talk with an excerpt from a book by Eugene Thacker titled In the Dust of This Planet, Horror of Philosophy. In his book, In the Dust of This Planet, Thacker explains that there has been a recent shift in our approach to the occult. In the past, occult philosophers believed that the world contained hidden higher knowledge and supernatural spaces that were waiting to be revealed, and that there are ways to attain this knowledge through the study of alchemy as an example. An example of a past occult philosopher is Heinrich Agrippa, who wrote a famous piece on the occult in 1509 titled The Three Books of Occult Philosophy. This more traditional occult viewpoint is illustrated by the Flammarion engraving from 1881, up there, pictured above. And in this picture, there's a man breaking through the known world into some kind of mind-blowing occult alternative reality. So that kind of gives you the general traditional viewpoint. So anyways, in Thacker's book, he writes that whereas in traditional occult philosophy, the world is hidden in order that it is revealed, and revealed is the world for us, in occult philosophy today, the world simply reveals its hiddenness to us. A second shift follows from this. Whereas traditional occult philosophy is a hidden knowledge of the open world, occult philosophy today is an open knowledge of the hiddenness of the world. For Agrippa, it is not only possible for humanity to gain knowledge of the world, but it is also possible for humanity to, by virtue of occult practices, obtain a higher union with the maker of all things. Thacker goes on to write that today, in an era of almost schizophrenically poised between religious fanaticisms and a mania for scientific hegemony, all that remains is the hiddenness of the world in its impersonal resistance to the human tout court. Hence, in traditional occult philosophy, knowledge is hidden, whereas in occult philosophy today, the world is hidden, and in the last instance, only knowable in its hiddenness. There are a few ways to interpret this. To me, it means that in the 21st century, we want to have something hidden and unknowable about the universe. I'm interested in the human desire for the existence of the supernatural and the way that this desire is translated into cultural stories and symbols. My artwork explores this idea through installations meant to depict fantasy in liminal spaces, installations and sculptures designed to suggest portals to other realms, and objects that suggest agency in other worlds. One of the elements that I draw from in my work is the mythologization of natural phenomena and transformation, such as evaporation and decay, into culture. Folklore and mythology are full of stories about transformation and explanations for natural phenomena. This illustration here, it's kind of a little spooky. It's an example from a Polish folktale titled The Snow Maiden. And it's one of my favorite folktales about natural transformation in the world. In this story, essentially a pile of snow responds to the prayers of a childless couple, and the snow transforms into a little girl. The girl and her parents live a relatively happy life until one day the girl participates in a game with village children where she jumps over a fire and immediately evaporates back into water. This story may also be a fable about the dangers of succumbing to peer pressure. And the natural world is mythologized throughout history. Early Western scientific study combines spiritual allegory with transmutation, defining chemical reactions as chemical weddings, and illustrating chemistry through Rosicrucian symbols and Christian allegories. And in contemporary popular culture, early myths about the supernatural are ever present. These are represented in the media, urban legends, and new waves of spirituality. My new obsession is Sailor Moon, by the way. In my work, mythology, scientific history, and New Age idealism become starting points for an investigation into the creation of meaning and the formation of knowledge. So this image here that was actually photographed by P.D. Rierick, who helped me a lot my thesis year, was my final thesis piece at Cranbrook. And it was a Victorian-inspired grotto that was designed to be a constructed fantasy. In the style of King Ludwig of Bavaria's grotto. And also, Aaron, the fantastic Cranbrook studio tech, helped me a lot in building this. This is another picture of it. And then also in my work, I strive to create artwork that explores transformation and the cultural creation of the natural world while simultaneously highlighting the transformation of the materials used to make the work and the transformation of the space surrounding the pieces. So this is a detail of the last image. And this installation was made out of camouflage netting and industrial netting and then handmade netting that I cut up and layered with lots and lots of layers of paint, and then would insert chandelier crystals into it. So it started to mimic the natural world and started to mimic natural parasitic plants. And then this is a piece I made outside of graduate school called Hylozoic. This piece is actually 15 feet high, and my work was beginning to shift, where instead of making large installations, this piece was designed to really control the space. And the platform was a geometric platform that was made out of plywood and then filled in with cob clay, dyed with iron oxide. And during the opening, people could walk around it and feel what it's like to be next to this kind of big structure. So this was a shift for me. Instead of thinking about almost decorating the space, this was creating something within the space. And this piece was made out of burlap and enamel, resin, and foam. This next slide is from a duo show in Portland called Of Other Spaces, named after the essay by Michel Foucault. And it was actually a duo show that I was with Cranbrook painting alumni Michael Endo, who has this painting in the back. And I have two pieces in this shot. The first one in the front is called Portal, and the one in the back is called Fairy Tale Trees. And these two pieces became a real big shift for me. One, I started to work with different materials. Both pieces are made predominantly out of glass. And they also, instead of creating an entire installation, they hint at the idea of a possible alternative space. So they become kind of portals or thresholds to other worlds. The piece in the back, Fairy Tale Trees, you can't really tell from this image, but both trees arc forward and it becomes something that you could walk under and enter into another space. And then this piece in the front is titled Portal. And it's actually a circle of mushrooms going through a transformation, a physical transformation. And the shape was inspired by fairy rings from folklore. And in folklore, whenever mushrooms grow in a circle, it's considered, people say that that's where the devil came, or that's where fairies had been the night before and danced in a circle. So I like that idea. And also Rip Van Winkle gets sucked into a fairy ring. So it's a potential space for you to get sucked into another world. So instead of showing an entire installation, I like this idea of a projected space or a psychological space. After I made those two pieces, I started to explore glass a little bit more. And I started to really think about the cultural and material meaning behind glass and other materials. And I think that sensibility really comes from my fiber education. Glass, with its rich aesthetic, scientific, and practical history, represent preservation while simultaneously signifying fragility and temporality. So I started casting these pieces that go through life and death forms, kind of reminiscent of different fairy tales, and other stories that explain natural occurrences as myths. And one of my favorite, I don't know why I'm so nervous. I've actually given this talk a bunch, and I think it's gotten better, but I found myself really nervous today. So here's another story. This is my favorite story about glass, and I think it's a nice one because not everybody knows it. It's called The Glass Mountain, and in this story, there are 7 brothers that get transformed into ravens by a curse from an evil stepmother. And they have one sister, and she doesn't get transformed for whatever reason. And so she sets out on a quest to go save her brothers. And on her quest, she meets a couple different characters along the way. She meets the sun, the moon, the stars, and they give her different gifts on the way so that she can enter into the space where her brothers are trapped. They're trapped in the glass mountain. And on the way, she meets the sun, and he gives her a wishbone that she will need when she gets there. And he says it's a key to the doorway. And so she's on her way trying to find the glass mountain. And the glass mountain is hard to find because glass reflects light, and so it's constantly shifting. You can't really tell where it is. When she finally reaches the mountain, it's hard to scale because it's slippery and you can get cut up. And so she finally climbs to the top, she gets to the doorway and realizes she no longer has the key to enter it. And so in a moment of desperation, she relies on her own body and she cuts off her finger and she sticks it into the doorway, and magically, because it's also a bone, like the wishbone, it turns and she's able to enter this other realm, and she saves all her brothers. And I love this story because I love the idea of a glass mountain. I also like the idea of the body and using your body to enter different spaces, and that's something that kind of repeats in my work over and over again. This is one of the first really big pieces I made out of glass. It's called Hall of Conversion, and it consists of 74 hanging glass dishes that contain little cast glass sculptures, and it's in a long, narrow hallway at Disjecta Art Center in Portland, Oregon. And when I was asked to do a installation in this space, I really didn't know what to do. I never actually wanted to do an installation in this space because I thought, what can I do in a long, skinny hallway? I make big work that transforms spaces into caves. And I don't know how to make that wheelchair accessible. I don't know what to do. So I had to really rethink the way I think about work and rethink the important elements. So I like the idea of people walking through the space and the work actually hanging in the center of it. So there are all these little suspended dishes, and they each have a different cast glass element in them, and each cast glass element weighs the exact same amount. And they're all different. They all go through different shape-shifting transitions. So there's a row on the right and a row on the left, and they're actually both different. They start with 2 different rocks, and I collected all the specimens myself. So they go from rocks into crystals, or they melt and they turn into plants, and then they melt again. And they also go through a color shift. And one of the most interesting things about this installation was the way people interacted with it, because everything was hung right below people's eye line, so they had to kind of look down, and then they had to be really hyper aware of their bodies as they move through the space. That's one thing that I find really interesting about glass, is that people are really uncomfortable around it, and they view it as this really hyper-precious, hyper-fragile material. And so I like what that does to the human body. It makes you aware of your body. And actually, in retrospect, I don't even know if there needed to be anything in those dishes. It could have just been little cubes of glass, and it could have just been as interesting to have people interact with those. But while I was making these pieces, I started to think a lot about the casting process and what it meant to weigh and measure out the glass and the water to do the math for the volumetric calculations. And what it meant to try to fill in the shapes of a stick with another material, and how one thing might transform into another. And so I kind of kept up with this for a little bit. And while I was doing this, I started to think more and more about alchemy and material transformation. And I started trying to do some research on alchemy online, which is a mistake. Every time I tried to do research online, I kept ending up reading things that seemed like World of Warcraft background information. I couldn't tell if I was reading Harry Potter fan fiction or not, because apparently Nicholas Flamel was actually a real person. I went to public school, I don't know. So I didn't know what to do, and so I realized I needed to actually go to a source and actually do some real research in a library. So I applied for a grant, and I went to the Beinecke library at Yale, and the Beinecke library actually houses the biggest alchemical manuscript collection in the entire United States. And this is the research room. That's not me, but people have been researching there for a long time. And one of the interesting things about the collection I found out once I went there is that it was collected by Mary Mellon, who was a dedicated follower of Carl Jung. And Carl Jung did a lot of research on the subconscious, on the collective unconscious, and was actually someone I've always been interested in. And so Mary Mellon went around and gathered together all of the books that Carl Jung had referenced, because he references a lot of alchemical texts in his lectures and his writings. And so she collected all the books that he talked about at auctions, and then her and her group of lady friends actually are the people responsible for bringing Jung over to the US and getting him started in the US. So that was really interesting. And so while I was there, I went through the entire collection. Everyone thought I was crazy. There's a huge amount, hundreds of books. They're dated from the 1200s to the late 1700s. And while I was there, I also met with Catherine James, who is the curator of that collection, and she was kind enough to sit with me and talk with me about the books and all the different symbologies that are inside of them. And she showed me a lot of books and also talked about the transformation that the books have gone through themselves. A lot of them are actually eating away at themselves because they were written with certain types of inks that are decaying. They're decaying. They almost look like lace patterns. And then the librarians and the archivists have been rebinding them each century, basically. And so they're going through all these different states of transformation within themselves and decaying. This is a book that she pulled for me called the Voynich Manuscript, which is a really famous book that I didn't even really know about. This library is amazing. They actually have a Gutenberg Bible there. I mean, it's the real deal of all old libraries in the U.S. So anyways, this manuscript is pretty amazing. It's supposed to be from the 1400s. It's written in a language that nobody can understand, and there's a whole cult following around this book. It's the first botanical manuscript that people have found, and there's all these different, some people think it's a fake. It's really interesting how there's just this whole, group of people really obsessed with this book. I didn't know about it, but she was over it already. She thought I should look at something else. But the interesting thing about this book is it's full of really crude drawings on old vellum, and it's just a really interesting text. And while I was there, I went with I said I was going to make a book about this library, and I went there and I realized I didn't really know what I was doing there. I didn't really know why I thought it was so important to go to the library. Everyone kept saying, the collection is digitized. Why do you need to come here? Why do you need to take photographs? I realize now because now I own the photographs, but I just kept sitting there thinking, what was the reason to come here? What's the desire to come and try to access knowledge? What was I expecting to happen? And so I just sat there looking at books, and they let you check out these giant magnifying glasses. So the risk of sounding like too much of a Harry Potter nerd, I just kept thinking, who do I think I am, Hermione Granger? And you're looking at, and it's really hard because all of our experiences have been so codified by pop culture. You can't look at these amazing texts without thinking about every movie you've ever seen where they're copying these texts. But anyways, the books are really interesting. What's really interesting is the amount of secrecy that all the writers of the books had. So this is an illustration of a phoenix that's been pasted over to obscure other text, and on the back side of that text, of that phoenix drawing, is backwards writing. So there's just all this secrecy and layering. It's really interesting. So this is another book where there's these different diagrams and dials. So after leaving the library, I realized that I still had a lot of thinking to do about it, and it's taken me about 2 years, but I realize it all comes back to that Eugene Thacker quote that I mentioned before about the desire for hidden worlds, and I think now after 2 years, I'm ready to actually make work about it. But that research kind of funneled into this solo show that I had at Bullseye Gallery this past summer called The Realm of Quantifiable Truths. And in this show, I decided to reference measurement as a link between the metaphysical pseudosciences, historic mythmaking, and contemporary spirituality. And I was interested in the idea of the act of measuring and observing as a way to create meaning, because as human beings, we believe that assigning value to specific units and magnitudes enable us to quantify vast distances, establish time, and compare scale. So this was really inspired by my trip to the library, because there's so many books about just people measuring things and quantifying things. Each piece in the show was named after a different type of measurement or measurement tool. And one of the things I thought a lot about in the show was just the differences between scale. So, and how that makes you consider your body. That's something that's always repeating in my work. So there are things that look like oversized necklaces. There are things that look like really oversized necklaces. There are things that are the width of a person's arm or the width of a person's leg, or are reminiscent of fingers pointing. And so I really like this idea of walking through something and constantly thinking about things next to you, things smaller than you, things that should be able to fit on your body but don't. And so that kind of carries throughout the piece. The title of the show was called The Realm of Quantifiable Truths, and it's a reference to Mel Bochner's work. And Mel Bochner is an American artist and is considered one of the founders of conceptual art. And I named the title of the show after an introduction essay that Jeffrey Weiss wrote on Bochner's 2007 Event Horizon show. And in the essay, Weiss called his work a representation of the world as a fantasy of quantifiable truth. And that really inspired me, so I kind of carried it into my show. And then this is a quote by Mel Bochner that really inspired me and influenced me while I was working on the show. He said, "Measurement is one of our means of believing that the world can be reduced to a function of human understanding. Yet, when forced to surrender its transparency, measurement reveals an essential nothingness." I was also making a lot of transparent glasswork, so I thought that was fitting. So anyways, and I named it The Realm of Quantifiable Truths because it's impossible to quantify something that's relative, like truth. So I like that idea of there being kind of an oxymoron within the title. This piece was called Fathom Phenomenon. Fathom is a measurement of the depth of water, and fathom is 6 feet. The piece in the back is Fathom Phenomenon, and then the piece in the front is called Threaded Increments, and this piece references an Incan Quipu counting system. And a kipu, meaning knot, is a recording device used in Andean civilizations as far back as the 7th century. And it's a whole record-keeping system where people tie knots as a way of recording time, recording goods and services. So I was thinking a lot about knot tying throughout this show. This piece is called Counting Cord, also inspired by rosaries and different counting systems. And then I started incorporating horsehair. One reason is because horsehair constantly repeats in folk tales. And I've always loved the story of the Goose Girl, where this maiden has her childhood horse's head gets mounted to a wall that she walks under every day. And the horsehair is hanging down, and then she's braiding her hair. So lots of references to hair. And she braids her hair as a way to count the days going by, and also it's a symbol of beauty. And then I dyed the horsehair purple to reference trends in pop culture, and then the magic association with the color purple. And then I've also started to think a lot about what does it mean to put two materials next to each other. So I like the idea of putting leather and hair, which are proteins, next to something made out of glass, which is sand and silica combined, and kind of what that means is almost an ingredient list. This piece is called divination rods, and a rod is a surveyor's tool. And I cast these pieces from rose branches, but I was also thinking about pointing and measuring with your finger, because early measuring systems are off of the body. So they also kind of look like weird gnarled little fingers. And each one of these different pieces is held in the wall with a steel bracket. And you can't tell in this photograph, but each bracket holds it with a different shape. So it comes out as just a stick coming out of the wall, and then it has a different shape, like a circle, a heart, a Star of David. And then the amount of branches that are shooting out from the top of it have to do with the amount of sides on that shape. So again, thinking about occult symbols in those texts that I was looking at the library. I like the idea of incorporating stainless steel because it's a cold material that's usually associated with measurement tools or doctor's tools. And then the bottoms of each of these stems were dipped in a silver solution. So it's actually not paint. The glass is having a chemical reaction at the bottom, so they're a little bit metallic. So here's a detail. You can see them coming out of the wall. One of the best things that happened with this piece is the shadow version of it. It's kind of like a drawing. And I chose to use rose stems, because roses are a repeating image in folklore and in Victorian motifs about the romantic. And then roses and brambles are just a reoccurring motif in folklore, and they usually grow over things magically to cover and protect. So I like that idea. You can see the brackets a little bit more. This next piece is really similar to crystalline conversion and hollow conversion. It's called metonic transfiguration, and it refers to the metonic cycle, which is a cycle of 235 syndonic months equal to 19 years, after which the new moon occurs on the same day of the year as the beginning of the cycle. And these pieces go through both a shape shift and also an opacity shift. So they go from being translucent to completely opaque and then translucent again. And then this piece was called Table of Material Contents. And each piece on this table related to a different piece in the realm of Quantifiable Truths exhibition. And all the materials used in the exhibition were represented on the table. So dyed horsehair, glass, leather, and silver were all present. And then the table surface itself was a pearlescent acrylic inset into whitewashed wood. And this created a juxtaposition of synthetic and natural materials. And again, the purple dye and pearlescent acrylic reference pop cultural mysticism. And then here are a few more recent pieces of mine. This piece is called Garland. I made it this winter. And this piece is made out of leather, rope, dyed horsehair, and then cast glass. And I started collecting studs. And I really love on pieces of fabric when something is so embellished that it takes on a new material quality, almost kind of like a skin. So I started playing around with what would happen if I studded my forms. So this piece is kind of funny in its redundancy. They're punk rock rocks. And actually, I think it's kind of an interesting piece because it's redundant, and it also, each material covers another material in a way that's completely unnecessary. So the rope is doing its job, but it's covered in black leather. The horsehair was actually already black, but I re-dyed it so that it was blacker. The rocks themselves were made out of obsidian that I collected, but obsidian is essentially already dark glass. And then the forms themselves are already rocks, but I covered them with something that implies rocks. So I thought that was kind of interesting. I also like how the studs start to look like a crystalline natural process is happening, even though they're a very culturally oriented symbol. This is another piece called Crystal Cord. This piece has a side pony. And then this piece is my most recent piece called Diver. And when I was making this piece, I was inspired by the history of pearling and how pearls are actually accumulation and a response to some kind of irritation within an oyster. And so I've been thinking a lot about that. I'm actually making more pieces inspired by that idea, and the idea that something natural that's actually a negative response or a protective response would then be valued as something precious and within our society. And so each of these pieces they're cast from real clams. And the interior of them is mirrored, so they reflect light around. And then they're filled with kind of a different variety of materials, so electroform plastic plants, crystals. Some are real crystals, some are crystals that I cast myself, dyed horsehair. So they're kind of little collages within each one. And then they again have stainless steel stands. And for me, I really connect these back to the grotto piece that I made my last year at Cranbrook. The grotto piece was a giant constructed fantasy that you enter into, and these are tiny little grottos that you can barely see into. And to me, it's actually more interesting to try to imagine what's in there, to imagine something secret, to imagine something magical. I think that desire is more powerful than trying to show my viewer an already set up idea. So this has been a really interesting kind of exploration for me. And one of the interesting things about this piece too is the way that they're installed. They're actually really low. So in order to see them, you have to bend down. So pretty much all of my work asks the viewer to move around a little bit in order to see into it. And that brings me to what I'm working on now. So I'm in the process of making an installation for a 2016 exhibition in the Scottish Highlands. And I've been given an entire barn in the Scottish Highlands to do an installation with. And I've gone out there two years in a row now to kind of document it. And I also taught a class out there. So I keep going out there to kind of get to know the space. Which is really a luxury because my first idea, I've gone through a couple different iterations of idea, and my sense of the space has changed, my sense of what I want to do with the space has changed. So this is the interior of one of the barns. It's going to be an exhibition center that'll open in 2016, and the exhibition center is actually a series of refurbished barns. So this is pre-refurbishment, barns and stables. So this gives you a sense of where the barn is located. Nowhere. It's in the middle of nowhere, in a beautiful area with lots of sheep and lots of fog, and lots of thistles. And it's right by Northland's Glass Studio in Leipzig, which is a really beautiful studio. This picture, I think, was actually taken at 11 o'clock at night. So the sun sets really late at night. It's a really beautiful, otherworldly place. And you can see somebody's working in the studio in the back. So this is the back of the studio. I'm doing a brief 2-week residency out there this summer to kind of get work prepped for the show, because the Glass Center and the barns are kind of connected. They have a relationship, so. And while I've been out there, I've actually developed my first collaborative relationship with another artist, a real one. And I've made a real live Scottish friend. This is Carlin Sutherland, who's actually an architect, a well-esteemed architect out there, and an artist, and she's doing a piece in one of the stables as well. So we worked in the studio together last summer. And Carlin grew up in the area, so she's got a really great sense of the history of the town and the history of the people. It's very different to be in a remote area of the world like that. So that's her making some of our work. And one of the things that I've been doing with Carlin is every time I go out there, I keep wanting to collect things to cast or reference, and I really wanted to do things that were very site-specific. And so one of the things that I've been really interested in is mushrooms, because they go through a decaying process, because they grow from decay, and because they reference fairy tales and psychedelic culture. So and foraging. So I've always been interested in them. And every time I've been out there, it's been the wrong season to collect mushrooms. So Carlin has been doing this lovely thing for me that I call mushroom correspondence, where she goes out and actually casts mushrooms in Scotland, in the wild, in her cute boots. And then she sends the molds back to me in America, and then I cast them. So I've been casting all these elements for the installation back in Portland, and then she collects them for me there. So that's been a lovely conversation that we've had back and forth, and I'm really grateful that my project has had time to really develop a little bit, because I keep changing my idea. And then these are my last few images. So since Carlin's been helping me, when I was out there, I helped her do some photography in the space. And like I said before, she's really interested in history and architecture. So one of the ways she was trying to kind of get to know this particular horse stable was by photographing the light in the stable. And she takes all these pictures in old buildings by going in and shaking cheesecloth filled with flour. And then the dust of the flour stays in the air, the dust particles stay in the air, and then when you photograph it, it really, all the light bounces off of it. So it looks like there's all this light coming in, but it's really just flour in the air. So to help her out, I would dust flour and take photographs of her, and then she would dust flour and I would take photographs. But the person's not supposed to be in the photographs, actually. These are just the behind-the-scene ones. But these are my favorite because it looks like we're chasing the light in a barn in Scotland. And she's provided us with these great jumpsuits. And that's the end of my lecture.